Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the MSA Union. This is really a very humbling opportunity for me to be in the presence of young and inquiring minds. It is an absolute pleasure. And let us consider the session as a conversation and really a space for sharing of thoughts and sharing of ideas. Now, if the previous session on economics was essentially about transaction, this session on Iman is about relations. Okay? Relations with the most important and primordial relationship is the relationship with Allah, Jalla Jalaluhu, the relationship with the Quran, the relationship with our Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, the relationship with the rest of creation, the relationship with the universe. So this is all, it's relational rather than transactional. Okay. Ustad Bediuzzaman says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, is the start of all things good. He doesn't say it is the start of all good things. He says it is the start of all good things, which means that when we embark upon any activity or process of thought, of intellect, or of endeavor, when we say the Bismillah, that transforms that action into an act of ibadah. So we too shall start with it. And Ustad Bediuzzaman says that there are three great and universal things that make known to us our Creator. The first one is what he refers to as the book of the universe. The next is the seal of the prophets, Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. And then the last one, the Quran of mighty stature. Now, he contends in the Risale-i, which is the treatise of light, that in numerous of its ayahs, the noble Quran invites men to reflect upon the universe and to reflect upon the divine activity within the universe. And he likens, therefore, the universe to a book. And in this kind of conceptual understanding, we understand that there are two books: the book of Revelation and the book of the universe, or the book of creation, both of which carry a Sharia. What we call in nature, the laws of nature, are in fact the Sharia that regulates creation. Now, being mindful of the fact that all of creation except human beings only submit to the Sharia in the universe. Human beings have to submit to the Sharia both in the book of Revelation, the Quran of mighty stature, as well as the laws that pertain and obtain within the book of the universe. And earlier on today, we talked a little bit about the idea of the Quran and the environment. But in fact, actually, the Quran is the environment. Because conceptualized as the book of the universe, it has its own, as I said, Ustad Bediuzzaman says, it has its own Sharia. And when we violate that Sharia, this is when environmental degradation actually occurs. So it is not an issue of sentiment, but in fact we are violating a Sharia. And I think it's important that we need to begin to grapple with this, so that it's no longer, we take it out of the realm of a kind of a feel-good, nice thing to do, but actually to conceptualize it in its essence, which is in fact that we are violating the Sharia. Now, the reason that Ustad Bediuzzaman likens the universe to a book, and he looks at it in the way shown by the Quran, which means that we must read it for its meaning. We must read and learn and understand Allah Jalla Jalaluhu's divine names and His sacred attributes, and the other truths of Iman that are contained within the Quran of Mighty Stature. Now, the book of the universe, he argues, is to describe its author and maker, and therefore all beings become evidences and proofs and signs to their creator. Okay? So therefore, a very important and fundamental element of the way of the Risale-i Nur is contemplation or tafakkur. Because the purpose for which we do this is not just in and of itself, but the reason that we reflect on the creational signs is for two purposes, two essential purposes. The first one is to increase in our knowledge of Allah, ma'rifatullah, and the second one is to begin to develop and obtain certain iman tahqiqi. So these are two very fundamental issues within the Risale-i Nur. So the very first word that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu in fact revealed to Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam was Iqra. So reading the book of the universe, reading the embodiment of the Quran in the character and in the actions of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, as well as reading the book of creation, of revelation, wahi, are very important. And I think, he gives a new and perhaps a more nuanced understanding of what we refer to when we talk about the Ahlul Kitab. Are we in fact people of the book? Because people of the book are those who read these three books. That is in fact what people of the book refers to. Okay. Now, the Risale-i Nur, Ustad Bediuzzaman also refers to it as the words. So I just need to get to my... Okay. He says that the words which proceed from the Quran are not only scholarly matters that address the intellect. They are matters of Iman that look to the heart, the ruh or the spirit, and spiritual states. They resemble most elevated, valuable knowledge of Allah. And this, in fact, in essence, is the way of the Risale-i Nur. It does not only bow to the intellect, but in fact talks about a holistic development of Iman. Iman that goes beyond the expression of it with our tongue, but that in fact we have to absorb the realities of Iman through all our faculties. Now, just in terms of the presentation and what the presentation is about. I've been asked, as you heard in the introduction, to just look at, some of the rationale for why the Risale-i Nur is a response in the 21st century to modernization. So we'll look very briefly at the decline of modern civilization and look at an indicative analysis of Bediuzzaman in terms of his view on where we are, why we are where we are today. We will also look at the foundational principles of modern civilization. We will then consider the Risale-i Nur and its foundational principles. And I've also been asked to comment a little bit about the methodology of developing a Quranic personality. And I would like to posit that, Ustad Bediuzzaman says that in order to develop Quranic personality, you have to root that within the conceptual understanding and framework of a Quranic civilization. Because that's the only way that it's going to make sense. Otherwise, at best, it's going to be adaptive and not transformative. Okay. Now, if we look at the genealogy of modern civilization, Ustad Bediuzzaman says that ancient Rome and ancient Greece, in fact, he calls them twins who have come from the same source, and both of which have placed enormous emphasis on this concept of genius. The Quran, and then Bediuzzaman then juxtaposes this view with the Quran, because the Quran places emphasis not on genius, but on guidance. So therefore we understand in this kind of typology that guidance comes from the heavens, genius comes from the earth. Okay. Now, if we look at these, what he calls the twins, and I think it's actually quite a quaint expression, in fact. He says they are two geniuses, but twins from a single stock. One is fanciful, and one is materialistic. So he contends that being brothers, they are related, but they've always had fights, these two. And then he talks about it almost as if there's been what he calls a metempsychosis, which is kind of a transmigration of a soul into another body. And he says it is as if the bodies of these two twins have changed in modern civilization, and what was fanciful was absorbed by what is today Germany, and what is materialistic has been absorbed into what is France today. Now, if we think about Germany, it is currently the strongest economy in Europe. If we think about German engineering, the BMWs that we drive, the Mercedes-Benz, the Audis, is the outcome of German engineering. Okay? Very high, if you look at the philosophers who have come from Greece, from Germany. So, and on the other hand, you look at France, it's all the fashion industry, the arts, the beauty. And Ustad Bediuzzaman says that these two brothers have always been in contestation, and that they have never really reconciled themselves. Now, if we look at the 21st century, the offspring of this kind of genealogy necessarily looks to consumerism and materialism and naturalism, and we know that today the challenges that face the world, in fact this morning there was some mention about scarcity of food. It's not the scarcity of food. It's actually, it's in fact the just allocation of that food to where it is needed most. So the world is not, there's no scarcity of food. It is just misallocated, and based on a whole number of imperatives, and I won't go into that because Maulana Karan spoke very eloquently and very succinctly about it this morning. But the two greatest problems that face the world today are abject poverty and inequality. In fact, inequality is far surpassing poverty on the global landscape as one of the greatest problems of modernity. Now, if we look at what are inherent, what Ustad Bediuzzaman calls, what are the seeds of unbelief that are contained within these systems of thinking and practice and so on. So if one looks at, for example, if we look at consumerism, this is based on a very fundamental understanding that human beings in our fitrah were created by Allah Jalla Jalaluhu with innumerable needs. Innumerable needs. So there's a constant wanting to satisfy our need. And clearly the social marketers have honed in on this very important and basic human principle, if you like. So there's this constant feeding of these needs. Now, part of this issue of consumerism is not just that we must have an ideological position about it. But in fact, we must understand that contained within consumerism is the seed of unbelief. Because when we focusing on satisfying our needs, we in fact run the risk of becoming attached to this world. Okay? And the seed, therefore, is then that we run the risk of denying the year after. Because we are so attached to this world and everything that it offers, that we then run that risk. The second issue on materialism is that everything exists in materiality. Think about our lives. Our lives are in fact constructed around making sure that all our bodily needs are satisfied. Whether that is food or clothing or cover or homes or transportation, it all is about satisfying the material. But perhaps what we a little bit less vigilant about is how we in fact nourish our subtle faculties. How do we nourish our ruh? Have you ever heard, where people say, gosh, I really feel so great in Ramadan? It is in fact because usually our bodily system, our digestive system is so busy working. But when the ruh is nourished through our increased reciting of the Quran, we read more tafsir, we make more nawafil, etc., etc. So clearly, our ruh then is nourished. So this constant and almost exclusive focus on materiality carries within it the seed of unbelief, which is that the denial of the eternal. Because we know that it is our ruh that animates our body, and that it is our ruh that is eternal, although this body will perish. Now, just a very quick glance at a schema, if you like, on what are the foundational principles of modern civilization. And, it's probably nowhere more apparent than currently in South Africa, and the challenge that we face is this issue of xenophobia. Okay. Now, if we look at the schema, we can absolutely begin to identify why we have the problems of xenophobia that we have, why we have the levels of gender-based violence that we have, violence against women, child rapes, it's a litany, in fact, of challenges. Now, Ustad Bediuzzaman says that fundamentally, the point of support of modern civilization is force, and not cooperation, and not virtue. The mark of force necessarily are aggression and hostility. Okay? The goal of modern civilization is self-interest. Remember on the previous slide, this issue around, the genealogy, that if one looks at genius, you begin to elevate the nafs, the soul. And think about in the US, for example, just as an example, a multi-billion-dollar industry has developed around the self-help books. It's all about self-realization. You need to assert yourself. You need to become self-assertive. Now, this is, in fact, inherently the principle of genius. It elevates the soul. It elevates the self. The Quranic civilization elevates Allah Jalla Jalaluhu and places Him at the center, not the self. So one can see that there is almost a diametric opposition in the conceptions, both in its understanding, but also in its application. Now, if we look at what is the relational principle that operates in modern civilization, it's essentially racism and negative nationalism, which in fact result in disastrous clashes and ultimately in annihilation, which is what we've seen. Xenophobia, in fact, follows this exactly, precisely because it has all the elements of these foundational principles. Now, as I've said, the The spirit of modern civilization is genius, and it looks primarily to the nafs and to the physical being, where this genius works in the mind and confuses the heart. Think about this, because when Ustad Bediuzzaman in fact juxtaposes the paradigm of a Quranic civilization, we will be able then to see how very different, conceptually and in its application, these issues in fact are. So that what is called for is complete transformation rather than simply adaptation, because the genesis of the issues are fundamentally different. You see, and I think we must be a little bit guarded when we talk about the Quran has the solutions. You see, solutions are only as good as how we have defined the problem and how we've made sense of it. So we cannot, I think it's a little bit naive for us to try almost in a, as Maulana Quran was saying this morning, in a fairly reductionist kind of way, try to now offer, the Quran is the solution for everything. We have to go back, and I think we have to be a little bit more inquiring about what is the basis, rather than just kind of going on a little bit of a sentimentality issue and say, well, the Quran is the solutions for everything. I'm not saying it doesn't have them, but we cannot just simply use that as a panacea. It has to be organic. We have to understand and analyze the situation in which we find ourselves exactly from the Quran in order to find the remedy. Okay. So in terms of the Risale-i Nur, it's a contemporary Quranic tafsir, and if you looked at the time at which Ustad Bediuzzaman lived, he lived from 1877 to 1960, which means that he was witness to three fairly big and important historical events. The two where he lived through both world wars, and he also lived at the end of the time at the end of the Ottoman Empire. So these were three quite significant events that have shaped world history. And these events have substantively influenced and shaped his understanding of the world, his making sense of it, and therefore, being inspired to write Risale-i Nur as the treatise of light, as the response to the challenges. And also earlier on, we said that he placed a lot of emphasis on this process of tafakkur and contemplation. Because in fact, the process of contemplation is the antithesis of the process of imitation. Because so much of what we do is imitative rather than reflective. So when we, for example, when we sit in our zikr and we say, Ya Rahim, for example, how do we actually see Rahim in the universe? How do we see manifestations of his divine names of Jalal in the universe? How do we see manifestations of his divine names of Jamal in the universe? Because the universe, Allah Jalla Jalaluhu created the universe in order for us to know him. Otherwise, deen would have been an esoteric exercise for us to sit in our imaginations and our intellectualizations. But actually, he therefore created and said, when you read the book of Revelation and you read the book of creation of the universe, that is how you get to know me. Because we know Allah Jalla Jalaluhu by his divine names, by his sacred attributes, by Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, and all the fundamental themes that are contained in the Quran. So his Quranic tafsir essentially has as its point of departure the ayah in Surah Baqarah, which was in fact recited this morning by the Qari. Alif Lam Mim, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alif Lam Mim. This is the book about which there is no doubt, a guidance for those conscious of Allah who believe in the unseen. So it's Alladhina yu'minuna bil ghaib, who believe in the unseen. So his point of departure in the Risale-i Nur is that he does not go about proving Allah's existence. because the book is for those who believe in the unseen. So we already know Allah exists. But what He does is that He goes about proving with reasoned proofs and arguments Allah's divine unity, wahidiyah. So this is the essence, And I just want to just leave you with a thought. We talk about, we talk about wahidiyah, we talk about ahadiyah, wahid, ahad. What do these actually mean? That's for you to think about. This is the kinds of issues that Ustad Bediuzzaman, Said Nursi, in fact explains in Risale-i. What is the difference between ahad and wahid? I'm not an Arabic linguist, not by a long shot, but from a conceptual understanding. And sometimes, and I think one of the challenges that we face today is that we have a sense that we understand Islamic terminology, but actually, at most, we understand its translated meaning. So when we ask somebody, what does Bismillah actually mean? They'll say, well, it's in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. But what does it actually mean? And I think that's when we begin to fall short. We can give its translated meaning, but that's all it is. How do we understand the Bismillah, for example? This is what Bediuzzaman does in the tafsir. And in fact, this issue of wahidiyah is the divine unity, is the golden thread that runs throughout the Risale-i. And think about in Deen, all the prophets, all came to confirm the one same thing, which is what? Divine unity. All the prophets did that. They all came to confirm and reconfirm the issue of divine unity. Okay. Now, the Risale-i as the response for the 21st century, that Ustad Bediuzzaman says that the great mobilization and the complete preparedness of the Risale-i as the tafsir for the 21st century is for the sake of two things. For the sake of strengthening Iman and for proving divine unity. Now, if we are cogent and we look at any problem in the world today, and if we actually begin to drill down into what is in essence the problem, we will find in essence it is the relational problem between us and our Creator. Because that is, as said earlier on, is the most important and the primordial relationship. Because in the Quran, the twin imperatives of Iman and Amal Salih are mentioned more than 66 times. That should tell us something. It is our relationship with our Creator and His Rasul, alayhi salatu wasalam, and with our fellow creation. And our fellow creation, people, does not just mean human beings. It means all forms of creation, from a blade of grass, to a planet, to a star, to a rhinoceros, to a microbe, to an elephant, you name it. So we have, in fact, an integral relationship at the level of Sharia with the rest of creation. So the idea of, the environment, we must take it out of its current issue of those green people. No, it's those Sharia people. That's the point. Alhamdulillah, I do want to congratulate this initiative, because it is really about developing our consciousness. But we have to begin to think about it differently. We must take it out of its realm of its kind of, what sometimes those kind of goofy, crazy people do. They're those greenies. No, and we kind of look at them sometimes with a little bit of disdain. But we need to rewire our thinking, our conceptual understanding of this issue, so that we no longer talk about the Quran and the environment. as if these two things are completely separate. They're not. Even the idea of Islam and economics, everything is contained, as the Maulana was saying earlier on, sometimes in embryonic form in the Quran. Okay? But obviously supplemented with other sources as well. So in the 21st century, like never before, there's been very powerful and concerted assault on the roots and foundations of Islam and of Iman. Okay? And that is why he says that, particularly with Risale-i Nur, he says, it's important for us to satisfy twin imperatives. The one is the text, and the other one is the intellect. Not that we bow down to the intellect, but we have to engage both with the text, the Quran and the Sunnah, but also with the intellect. This is an important issue because we cannot contemplate, and we cannot reflect if we're not using our intellect. Okay? So we have to begin to turn the faculties with which Allah Jalla Jalaluhu has created us to its correct purpose. Okay? And this is an important issue. Now, Ustad Bediuzzaman says that the Risale-i Nur is not only repairing some small damage or some small house. In fact, the assault on the foundation of Iman requires that there has to be a concerted and vigorous response to this assault on the very foundations of Iman. And therefore the Risale-i Nur is striving to cure with the medicines of the Quran and Iman, and to cure that through the generally held ideas and that have essentially been propagated through methodologies of corruption. Okay? So that we buy into things, and we were having a discussion earlier on that as Muslims, we must stop being so apologetic and try to appease. Sometimes, indeed, we have to speak uncomfortable truths. Whether this is based on gender, whether it is based on inheritance, these are immutable issues. So in our attempt to appease Western thought, we become a little bit too apologetic, and we try and use the discourse and the narratives that will appease the mainstay understanding and conceptualization of how we make sense of the world. We must be unapologetic because our foundational principle is not genius, it is guidance. And the guidance that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, in fact, continuously reminds us about the Quran, that is immutable. Everything else is relative. And I really so therefore want to make an appeal. And the one thing that, Ustad Bediuzzaman puts a lot of emphasis on is this issue of non-imitation. Let's not imitate. Let's innovate in our thinking, in our practice, not innovate from a bid'ah perspective, but the idea, for example, one of the challenges in Muslim scholarship up until today is that there's been a lot of replication and not enough critical analysis. We have to become more critical. And in the Risale-i Nur, for example, his methodology is that he asks certain questions. Why was shaitan created? Isn't that unfair? Now, if you think in traditional scholarship, people say, Tawbah, 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 you shouldn't be asking such questions. But his point is, to become certain, you have to have grappled. You must ask questions. We must ask questions. And I think part of the alienation that many young people feel today is that because there's so much this ethic about you mustn't question anything. You must just follow, or you must do as you were told. Now, that was my generation. The generation today, they don't buy that. So if we are going to be able to stem the seeming disenchantment that young people sometimes seem to be experiencing, is that we must be able to respond with a methodology that satisfies their inquiring minds and their curiosity. But think about this issue of curiosity. I'm always very intrigued by young children. I think they're the greatest teachers, actually. Not all the Maulanas, and no disrespect intended. Young children have an amazing innate ability called curiosity, isn't it? Don't you see children always digging into things, trying to take things apart, doing things that they're not supposed to, going to places that they're not supposed to? And what do we do that? What do we do as parents? We stifle it. We stifle this issue of curiosity. Don't do that, you're going to get hurt. Don't do that, you're going to get dirty. So in fact, as we become older, this process of atrophy actually happens. We kill our own curiosity. We're no longer curious about anything. We're so blasé, seen it all, done it all. That's kind of, what a boring place in which to be. What about that curiosity? Have we ever thought about, I don't know if you've ever done this, have you ever taken apart a rose? It is the most, subhanAllah, the most spectacular visual, tactile, and olfactory experience. You feel that, so you look at this rose and you say, MashaAllah, how beautifully Allah has created this rose. There's a very common refrain, don't go through life, take time to smell the roses. My point is, take time to take apart a rose. And then, we talk about, how do I get close to Allah? That's as close as we get. Because we see Allah's divine names of power and beauty and majesty and geometry and determination and form. We see all of that in a rose. We get caught up sometimes a little bit too much on the intellectualism of life. And we actually miss the reality of it. So we live in the world of ideas and we live less in the world of reality. And Allah Jalla Jalaluhu in fact created the universe precisely so that we can know Him. But we pass through the universe, we're driving and we pass through all of that. We pass all that by. But then we go and sit in a classroom and we want to, imbibe all these tomes of knowledge, and it's wonderful, alhamdulillah. But what about the divine immediacy and the divine presence that is in the universe and that is in creation? Muslims typically, and this is a very, very crude generalization, we don't have pets. Why? Why don't we have pets? Because they scratch the furniture. The cat hairs are all over the place. But actually, when a cat, the cat, did you know that scientists cannot determine what a purr is? The purr of a cat. They don't know what it is. Do you know what Ustad Bediuzzaman says? What the purr actually is Ya Rahim. The purr of a cat is Ya Rahim. And science, they've tried, they don't know where it comes from. And of those of you who have cats, at Salah time, where are your cats? They come to you. They come, they sit on your musalla, isn't it? When they wash their face, doesn't that remind you of wudu? See, these are the realities. This is the reality of deen. But you see, we go to the tomes and the books and we try and really kind of absorb and all of this, but simple realities in our lives. Our mothers and grandmothers and grandparents had what we call green fingers. Very strong iman. They knew they talked to the plants, by the way, and we kind of think that's a little bit cuckoo. But they had something going on, because they understood without university degrees and alims and ijazas, they understood based on the strength of their iman that this is Allah's creation. And that when I speak to Allah's creation, they actually respond. Science has proven that. They actually respond. So, we talk about we the Khalifa of Allah, the vicegerent of Allah on earth, and that Allah Jalla Jalalu has subjected all of creation to us, but we pay it so little attention. So what's the point? What is actually the point of being Allah's vicegerent on earth, when in fact we are ignoring the greater part of the vicegerency that we in fact are supposed to hold sway over? What is it that we're actually doing? Are we real? Are we serious? And, so these are the things, that Ustad Bediuzzaman, in fact draws our attention to. That also, that in strengthening Iman, in strengthening Iman, the Risale-i Nur follows a path that unifies and harmonizes the reason and the heart. Because he also says, if we just pay almost exclusive attention to our heart, our minds get up to mischief. Think about when is the time when we are most distracted? Is in our salah. Isn't it? That's when our mind starts wandering and we're thinking about a whole lot of things. But actually, at that point, we are meant to be in conversation with our Creator and with our Sustainer. It's in fact a sacred conversation that we're supposed to be having. But we're not, and that's the time that we really, really get very, very distracted. The Risale-i Nur, is also based on the classical Islamic philosophical position of Mumkin al-Wujud and Wajib al-Wujud, which in its essence means that creation are contingent, which means that we need something to bring us into existence. Allah Jalla Jalaluhu is necessarily existent, which means that He needs nothing to bring Him into creation. He has always been there. He's always been necessarily existent. So therefore, we think about, is Allah in the heavens? How can Allah be in His creation? Allah can never be in His creation. Okay? So we must be a little bit mindful. Okay, let's move on. The Risale-i Nur is known essentially as a Manavi tafsir. Now, you're obviously very familiar, you're all students of knowledge. You understand that the classical traditional tafsir is fairly sequential. It looks at, the ayah, it looks, for example, what is the reason for its revelation, etc., etc. Ustad Bediuzzaman in the Risale-i Nur takes a very different approach. He has taken an approach which the tafsir is a tafsir which explains the truths that the Quran teaches. So by its methodology, it's thematic. So it's not sequential. So for example, if he's talking about the malaika, for example, he would look at the ayahs in the Quran that speak about the malaika and then discusses it like that. Okay? So these are the truths from the Quran. So the truths of Iman that the Risale-i Nur essentially focuses on is on the screen. It's Allah's divine names and His sacred attributes. It's the divine activity in the universe. It's resurrection, prophethood, qadr, and man's duties of ibadah. So this is essentially what Ustad Bediuzzaman focuses on in his tafsir. Now he makes a very important point, and I would like to invite all of you to think about this one. He says that Iman is the highest and the most subtle science. Iman is in fact a science. It is not simply an issue of articulation of the tongue. Amantu billahi wa malaikatihi wa kutubihi wa rasulihi. Yes, of course, that is important. But he says it is the highest and most subtle science. It is what we win or lose on. This is it. All the theories, all the understanding, all of that is important, but they are all subservient and subject to this most fundamental issue, which is Iman. Okay. Now, what the Risale-i Nur essentially does, and I've called it the Iman barometer. And all of us should look at this barometer and identify for ourselves, where am I? So he says that the Risale-i Nur requires that all our faculties are satisfied. We've said that. It's to bring to Iman those without Iman, to bring to faith those without faith, to strengthen the faith of those whose faith is weak, to make certain the faith of those whose faith is strong but imitative, and it gives greater breadth to the faith of those whose Iman is certain, which ultimately leads to Ma'rifatullah. Just a very short comment on Ma'rifatullah and Muhabbatullah. We talk about, yes, we love Allah. Can we reasonably love that which we do not know? Can we walk up to a stranger in the street and declare our undying love? It's nonsensical. So therefore, Ustad Bediuzzaman puts a lot of emphasis on Ma'rifatullah, to know Allah, because we can only love that which we know. And yes, we say, yes, I love Allah, until somebody comes along and we fall in love with that person, and then we worship the ground that they walk on. So this idea, yes, of course, inshallah, Allah Jalla Jalaluhu instills this love for Him through our practices and the following of the Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam, but also through getting to know Him. And we know Him through His divine names, all throughout the Quran. And think about this, the ayahs in the Quran, always at the end, almost always, culminates in divine names. He's the most merciful, or He's the one all-knowing, or He's the one most powerful. So if you look at the methodology in the Kalamullah, it's in fact a summation of the ayah that precedes it. This is the methodology in the Quran. So when we look at that ayah, as the earlier speaker was saying, when we look at 2 or 3 ayahs per day, look at the divine names that are the culmination at the end of any ayah, and we will understand it's in fact the summation of the ayah that has gone before. This is how we know Allah. Now, towards the Quranic personality, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I do have this in PDF format. I perhaps could just email it as notes for the participants if you so wish, because I've gone through it quite quickly. As I said at the beginning, in order to aspire to a Quranic personality, it has to be born out of the Quranic civilization. The point of support in the Quranic civilization is truth. Its mark is justice and balance, and its security and well-being for all of creation. This does not only refer to human beings. If we think about its life principle, it's a principle of cooperation. We strengthen the bonds of deen, of brotherhood. We look at general well-being, we look at unity, we look at solidarity, everything that is juxtaposed in relation to the foundational principles of modern civilization. And then Ustad Bediuzzaman says that the spirit of the civilization is guidance which illuminates the ruh, and in fact gives man an angelic countenance. Whereas the genius works in the mind and confuses the heart, guidance works in the mind and in the heart. Okay? And that's just a little side by side for you to have a look at how conceptually these two issues are so completely different. And then just lastly, on the Quranic personality, he says that all true ways leading to Allah Almighty are taken from the Quran. And I think, they should give us some pause to reflect. At a time that we are living where we are making divisions, we're making takfir, we're doing all kinds of things which are actually so goes against the Islamic ethos. All true ways leading to Allah Almighty come from the Quran. As there is no monopoly in economics, there is no monopoly in deen. We always believe that my way is the only way. No, it's not. In fact, it militates against the fundamental principle in the Quran, where the Quran is a book of guidance, it is a book of law, it is a book of instruction, it's a book of teaching, and each of us gain, and the resonance that we find that in the Quran. So the Risale-i Nur's way also is taken directly from the Quran and comprises of 4 steps. The one is impotence, which Ustad Bediuzzaman says. Through ibadah. We're talking here about existential impotence and poverty. Okay, we're not talking about glorifying poverty, no. So, through ibadah, in our impotence and in our understanding that first of all we are contingent, we are relying on Allah for everything, literally for everything. This leads to winning Allah's love. The poverty leads to His name of all merciful. The step of compassion leads to His name of all compassionate, and reflection leads to His name of all wise. Now, these 4 steps, as I said, comes directly from the Quran. And the ayah, therefore do not justify yourselves, from Surah An-Najm, ayah number 32, points to this step. We see our impotence and our poverty and our faults before Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. Be careful, not to man. We see our faults according to Allah. We follow the practices of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. We perform all our religious obligations and we give up serious sins. And we establish the salah correctly and with intention, and we follow them with the tasbihat. He places a lot of emphasis on this because he says the 33 times that we say Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah and Allahu Akbar after the salah is in fact the summary of the salah. Because those 3 expressions in fact we find throughout the salah, both in our articulation and in our postures. So this is an important point. And he says that man loves himself more than anyone. He points out the faults of others, but we do not accept fault within ourselves. So the tazkiyah, the process of that is not to absolve ourselves of faults and weaknesses. The second step is poverty. Comes from the Quranic ayah from Surah Hashr, ayah number 19, and be not like those who forget Allah, and He therefore makes them forget their own selves. And Ustad Bediuzzaman makes a very important point when he says our nafs drives us to exclude ourselves when it comes to some inconvenience or to serve others, but we include ourselves when there's some benefit or some reward to be had. And the tazkiyah is to forget ourselves when it comes to pleasure, but to think of ourselves when it comes to death and service of others. The third one is compassion. Whatever good happens to you is from Allah, but whatever evil befalls you is from yourself. From Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 79, points to this step. The tazkiyah is that we must understand that our perfection lies in imperfection, that our poverty lies in our impotence and our wealth in our poverty. And the reflection, everything will perish save His countenance. Surah Al-Qasas, ayah number 88, points to this step. And the process here is that we give up egotism and recognize that the person who finds the necessarily existent one, whose names all beings manifest, necessarily finds everything. And it's really lovely that tazkiyah has just walked in. The tazkiyah in the Risale-i Nur is to educate and to train the nafs rather than annihilating it. Okay? And I leave you with the words of Bediuzzaman Sayyid Nursi, who says, if my voice was strong enough, I would shout out to the whole earth. The words, the Risale-i Nur, are beautiful, they are truth, they are hakikat, but they are not mine. They are rays shining out from the truths of the noble Quran. And you can read, download the Risale-i Nur and read the full text on those apps. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وآخر دعوانا وأن الحمد لله رب العالمين. Sure.
Do we have any questions?
I would be surprised if they didn't.
Any questions? Jay? Who was it? Oh, Mark.
Walaikum salam.
Thanks for sharing that with us on the Risale-i. My question is about how do you find, for example, a sequential study of the Quran, the sequential study of the tafsir versus a thematic study. I see benefits in both. Obviously, considering what I am studying, I would like a sequential study, but there's a lot of benefits in a thematic study. If you could elaborate on that, how the Risale-i ties that in.
Yeah.
Because it's not a sequential study.
Sure. Firstly, I think there are for me there are two issues. Sometimes, we are particularly intrigued by a particular topic. Now, how does one find that in a conventional tafsir or traditional tafsir? I want to know, for example, why did Allah create Jahannam? As an example. I know that Jahannam exists, because in the Kalamullah, of course, it is very clear that Jahannam exists, but I want to understand, why did Allah create Jahannam? What is the purpose? Now, so I can go in the Risale-i Nur tafsir, and I can go to that section. And I can then go and find out, and then, of course, augment it, of course, with pleasure, with the other tafsir. The other issue is that also for myself, I do not speak Arabic. Alhamdulillah, I have a partner who does, but I don't. So it's, so many of I know that, for example, a lot of the tafsirs are now being translated into English, and is making it a whole lot more accessible. But what resonates for me is that the approach in Risale-i Nur is essentially about trying to know Allah. And Ustad Bediuzzaman has developed what we call a theology of names, which is a very practical kind of theology for ordinary people to understand. So for me, the thematic approach is almost intuitive, because it speaks to the issues that we're grappling with today. We want to understand, for example, how do I know Allah? And in Risale-i Nur, that is what is explained, how to know Allah. So for me, it's a very practical approach, and it's something that one can, in fact, almost immediately implement, because the process in the Risale-i Nur is that we must read, we must understand, we must reflect, we must transform, and we must act. And that resonates for me. This issue around positive action really, really resonates for me. So for me, in short, the value that certainly that, alhamdulillah, I gain from it is that its thematic approach for me deals with the issues that I in modernity grapple with.
Right, do we have any more questions? No. All right. I think on behalf of everyone here today, I would like to say it was such a pleasure hearing you speak and listening to what you had to say. Jazakallah so much for coming through. This is a gift from all of us to you as well. Jazakallah so much.